Well, now that we know that fingerprints are formed early and that they have a longevity associated with them, let's take a look at the pattern types that are used for the classification of these fingerprints. We're going to talk about the three basic fingerprint patterns. The first fingerprint pattern is referred to as an arch. And if we take a look at the arch overall pattern, and we pick a line or a friction ridge, as it's referred to, on one side of this pattern, and we follow it in from one side towards the center, we are always going to have a slight upthrust, followed by a slight decline, and then that particular ridge is going to exit from the opposite side from which it entered. So we have our first type of fingerprint pattern. The second fingerprint pattern type of our three basic types is referred to as a whorl. Now, the first thing that you will notice about this pattern is that it appears circular. It has this nice round appearance to it. The second feature of the whorl that you have to find in order to classify this pattern as a whorl is it has two areas on either side of the circular area that look like triangles, or where the friction ridges form what is referred to as a delta appearance. So in order to be classified as a whorl, a fingerprint pattern must have an overall circular appearance and two deltas. That brings us to the third basic type, in addition to our arch and our whorl, and that is the most common pattern type referred to as a loop. The loop pattern, you will see, has this somewhat bobby pin appearance in the center or the core area, and the loop will have one delta. Remember, that's the triangular area of a fingerprint. So let's take a look at the loop appearance. If we pick a ridge along one side of this particular pattern, the side that's opposite of the delta, and we follow that ridge in, it is going to go up, and then it's going to make that hairpin or bobby pin feature of turning and then exiting on the same side from which it entered. So this entering, then hairpin turning, and going out the same side along with one delta, classify this as a fingerprint loop pattern. So in summary, when we talk about classification of fingerprints and their classifications, we are talking about arches, whorls, and loops. But we have also seen that at crime scenes or as part of a criminal investigation, we're going to find fingerprints as physical evidence common in those crime scenes. But there are three basic types of fingerprints that are going to be found at crime scenes. And so I'd like to tell you about the three different fingerprints found at crime scenes. The first type of fingerprint that's found at a crime scene is that kind of fingerprint pattern that has a visible appearance. And essentially what has happened is a material has coated the fingerprint or the fingertips, and that material is then transferred to another surface. And literally what happens is you see an outline of the friction ridge detail. That particular type of fingerprint is referred to as a visible fingerprint. The second type of fingerprint that is found at crime scenes is referred to as a plastic fingerprint. And this is essentially what happens when a finger contacts a very soft surface. For instance, a piece of Play-Doh or window putty, or maybe you've done this at home when the paint's not quite dry at home and you go up to it and you touch it and you leave your fingerprint in the paint because it's still wet. That's a plastic fingerprint. So we have visible, plastic, and we have a third type referred to as the latent fingerprint. The latent fingerprint, the third type, is the most common type found at crime scenes. And this is essentially an invisible fingerprint. It is going to be made visible, but it starts out being invisible. And essentially what happens, the oils, the salts, and the residue from the fingerprint surface of the finger is transferred to another surface. For instance, if you pick up a drinking glass and then set it down, you will look at the fingerprints on that glass and see them. They're classified as invisible because you're only transferring residue. Now, in forensic science and in crime scene investigations, those latent fingerprints have to be enhanced or made visible. In your workbooks, you're going to be asked to roll some fingerprints so that you can identify some basic patterns. Now, don't go wake up your dad if he's sleeping on the couch, but what you need to do is either find a volunteer you can work with or find someone who will roll your fingerprints. And what you're going to do is you are going to put your fingerprints or your volunteer's fingerprints on this 10-print card. And once the fingerprints are on the 10-print card, then you should be able to identify which of the three basic patterns you have: the arch, the whorl, or the loop. Once you've found the person that you're going to fingerprint, it's important that they remain limber and the hands loose, so that the person who is doing the fingerprinting is the one that is directing the ink onto the paper. In this job, you need to start with one side of the finger, roll completely to the other side, then carefully lift up and then press it down on the paper and re-roll it. Careful not to smear when you've finished.